Welcome to AnthroDish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Sarah Dugnan. Oftentimes, when we think about plant and human relationships, we're thinking about our contemporary lives and how plants factor into that, be it North American plant-based diets or what we're growing in our apartments, like my monstera here. But our relationship with plants goes back millennia, and accessing this historical and prehistoric knowledge is a glimpse into what life looked like for ancient humans. My guest this week is Dr. Shalen Prado, who's here to explore what we know about plant-based eating during the medieval period of Scotland. Shalen is a settler archaeologist living in Saskatoon and originally from the East Coast, Mi'kma'ki or Prince Edward Island. She researches ancient human-plant relationships and foodways. Shalen currently works as a Living Skies postdoctoral fellow at the University of Saskatchewan and collaborates with the Bridge to Land Water Sky Living Lab. On today's episode, Shalen shares some of her research on the elusive Picts of Scotland and how she uses phytoliths and ceramic sherds to uncover what plant-based eating looks like for this group of people during the medieval period of Great Britain. If you don't know what phytoliths are, don't worry, keep listening. Shalen does a great job of explaining it and how you can use those to really understand what sorts of plants were being eaten or how they were being prepared. Here's my conversation with Shalen. Welcome to the show, Shalen. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good, good. We've got a little mini co-host here, so there might be a little bit of squawking, but I'm really excited to chat with you more about your research. Before we kind of jump into the bigger conversation today, do you mind giving listeners a snapshot of who you are, where you're coming in from, and the type of work that you do?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Shalen Prado. I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist. I'm currently employed as a postdoc at the University of Saskatchewan, and I work with a huge interdisciplinary project called the Bridge to Land Water Sky Project, which is an Indigenous-led living lab looking at agriculture and First Nations reserve. But as an archaeologist, I'm interested in understanding ancient ways, and so where I kind of join up with that project is I look at pre-colonial food residues on that have been retrieved from archaeological excavations in the past. So I'm not doing any excavation, but I'm looking at kind of what we can learn from things we already have and understanding these kind of ancient diets to hopefully find some interesting little pieces that we can use for our forward conservation and our food strategies. But yeah, today I'm going to be talking about some of my PhD research primarily. And I'm joining you today from sunny Saskatoon, Treaty 6 territory, and homeland of the Métis.
Awesome. I'm so excited to jump into your research because I know we come from the same alma mater and I heard like little tidbits of your research through time, but getting to see it all come together is always so exciting. So I wanted to kind of set the background and just have you explain a little bit more about the community of people that you were looking at in the past, who the Picts were, and, were they challenging to learn about archaeologically, or were you coming into a realm where there's lots of information available to kind of build off of as you're researching?
So the Picts are really interesting people. They've been described a lot of ways, maybe as a lost people of ancient Europe or these barbarian painted people that were constantly plaguing and rebuffing the Romans at the northernmost reaches of the Roman Empire in Britain or Britannia at the time. So they're shrouded in a lot of mystery and misconception and popular culture. They get a tattoo, which is interesting. That's where the name Pictish comes from. They were described in Roman sources around 300 CE as these tainted barbarians. So we don't have a lot of historical information for them and almost zero historical information for them from their perspective. So they're really only being described by the Romans, who are, quite begrudging these people who are rebuffing them. But some information comes from the Irish medieval kingdoms as well, and to my knowledge, nothing from Anglo-Saxons, which are coexisting in the south. So examining them archaeologically is almost the only way that we can understand who these people are through their own residues, their own trash, as it's commonly said in archaeology, the things they've left behind for us to understand that they're from them. So yeah, archaeology is a really interesting way to get at it. And there's a lot of really exciting new programs in archaeology coming up right now for example, the contemporary or comparative kingship project and the Northern Picts project, which I was fortunate to work on.
Oh, that's incredible. And I mean, it speaks to how you approach your work in general more broadly, but particularly in situations where you only have historical evidence or historical narratives of a group of people that are a little bit more negative or biased. Having that opportunity to look at it in a way where, you're looking at material remains and kind of speaking to that rather than like those social biases is really interesting. And I'm curious if you can speak a bit more to, how you look at the relationships between humans and plants within your work. Explaining what like starches are, phytoliths, things like that, and what sorts of questions you can ask when you're looking at those.
Hmm. So technically I would classify myself as an environmental archaeologist. And then within that subgroup, a paleoethnobotanist, which is just a very long word to essentially say I study ancient plants through a cultural lens. So through paleoethnobotany, we can really get at a lot of unique questions that we can't through like animal remains necessarily. And paleoethnobotany kind of developed in the 60s and really kind of hit the ground running in the 80s when we started to develop these more archaeological science techniques to really find these plant remains. Because for the most part, you can't, while you're excavating, you can see when like a horseman comes out, so that you can see with your naked eye. But with seeds, they often degrade over time, might just be trailing away and you don't see them, and they get put into backfill, or they're microscopic in my case. So we kind of have to get really innovative with your technique finding these remains just to start with. And in the case they are even preserved in the macrobotanical sense, we can see it has to be kind of an accident. So if you imagine you're poaching rice or you're cooking a meal and you step away for a moment and then it becomes charred. You've made this horrible mess, we call them it. And then you end up chucking it somewhere. It will preserve because it's been charred. This can also happen through desiccation, freezing, all of these kind of environmental or social accidents that allow for that organic material to be preserved. So on the one hand, you can be lucky and find one of these accidents, but on the other hand, you might need some more innovative methods. So for me, I look at phytoliths and starch grains, which are essentially microscopic plant particles, and they become, in the case of phytoliths, they're made out of silica. So when the plants are living, they take up silica from the groundwater and the minerals in the soil, and they deposit them in their cell wall. And these make specific shapes, which can be really fun sometimes. Like there is a dog bone shaped phytolith. And for grass species, that's really fun to find in the microscope. When the plant dies and decays in the place, it will deposit these back into the soil. And these are some things that I can find in someone's house and say, oh, they were using cereal grains here. We can see that they were maybe testing the cereal grains in this location. Starch grains, on the other hand, we've all heard of starchy foods. What that means under the microscope anyway is these are the little teeny storage systems of plants. They store their carbohydrates for lasting through the winter or just for excess storage. And so when you grind up these parts of the plant, like tubers or seeds or grains, you can see them under the microscope. And they're very interesting, very colorful. If you put them under certain filters, they like radiate under cross-polarized light, and that's how we can kind of see their starches. For starch grains, you can see them fluoresce under different polarized light, and based on their shape, just like the phytoliths, we can tell what specific species they can. So tubers
Cool.
kind of look like this elongated shape. So some people can see what they look like. It's kind of hard to describe. Beans kind of look like kidney shape, which is funny. Some beans are kidney shaped. Maize or corn looks like a stop sign. So all of these little intricate details tell us specific species and can also tell us how things were cooked in some cases. So we really get at that individual level, specific detail around people's foods.
That's so, so fascinating. And I immediately was thinking of like how many bad meals that people were so embarrassed by that are, then going on to tell the story thousands or hundreds of years later of, dinner failure that became part of an everyday life piece. I'm curious too, like you spoke a little bit about how you can see if certain foods are cooked or not through the residues that you're looking at. Is it possible to tell, different phases of food preparation through these residue analyses as well?
Yeah, so to a certain extent, yes, starches aren't always, they don't always react the same with different experiments. There's a really good study out there by Amanda Henry, who's a prolific starch analyst, she essentially did an experimental approach of cooking different starches in different ways. And she was able to identify different morphological, so like characteristic changes of starches, specific for boiling, specific for parching, possibly also for fermenting, which is exciting. But it was only observed in 15% of the grain, so it's a bit of a stretch. But yeah, so in a lot of cases that I was finding, at least you can pretty much break it down to a raw starch versus a signature. And from there, you can tentatively identify it a little bit more. So I was observing in the Pictish example some raw grains. So it would indicate to me either really uncooked or possibly a storage situation. Definitely some boiling damage as well. So that kind of brings you into, boiling cereal. You kind of get straight to like cereal, like an oatmeal or something like that. Could also be a bread signature as well. They're not that different. But yeah, so you can get those signatures just from seeing how they decayed over time, which is really
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's just so cool that you can, again, like you can capture these sorts of past meals and have a sense of like how not only what was eaten, but how it was prepared in some regard as well. And I'm curious with the Pictish sites that you looked at, what sorts of plants were you finding there? And were they, what you would expect to see based on like how people are eating in that region in a contemporary way, or was it a totally different type of plant that they're eating at that point?
so for the most part, I'm confident that it's absolutely cereal grain. Once we get to the specific genus species, like specific type of cereal grain, it gets a bit trickier. Basically, it's like, does it have a dimpled surface? Then it could be barley. So I'm tentatively quite confident that it's barley, and that's because there is a lot of contemporary tradition in Scottish food. The Picts will transition to be Scottish people and to a certain extent. So lots of things like Scotch broth you can kind of imagine, which is like a Scottish stew mixed with other vegetables, which unfortunately don't leave starchy signatures. But so we kind of have to fill in the blanks there. But things like oat cake, oatmeal, porridge, pottage, which is like a savory porridge, bannock is another one that comes to mind. Ale, potentially. There was a little bit of fermented starch grains that I will say in this podcast could have, which is extreme. But then it could be, something a little bit more identifiably started, like I guess has oats and some barley included in it too. So definitely there's a through line from like an agricultural sense of really focusing on cereals and what is known as.
It's always exciting when the research lines up with like what you would expect to find and kind of solidifies that story too. Because I find with archaeology, sometimes you get a totally different story and you're like, but wait, this doesn't make sense for that region. So it's cool to see that.
And sometimes that can be fun too. But
Yeah.
I was a little disappointed that there weren't any like nuts or tubers. There might be a cheeky tuber in there, or even beans like legumes, peas. Those are kind of talked about more in the Anglo-Saxon and Irish context. But it really seems like at least in these um, they weren't putting any beans in them. So maybe they were eating them fresh or cooking them in another way. But yeah, in Finland so far, no evidence for legumes.
And I guess that leads me to my next question around it too is, thinking about Pictish food in general and knowing that, you've kind of got a limited archaeological or historical narrative of them. How much do plant-based foods make up a diet? And are you able to kind of, is it centralized to the diet or is it a part of a bigger whole that's not necessarily able to be captured through that?
Mhm. Yeah, so right now, the discussions are mostly saying that there's a mixed pastoral and agricultural economy. So a lot of the zooarchaeological evidence, which is animal remains, is pointing to the same pattern we're observing in Anglo-Saxon England and medieval Ireland, more closely to medieval Ireland than Anglo-Saxon England, in my opinion. So we're seeing cattle really predominant in the meat production. Could also be using them for labeling, things as a draft animal, maybe for dairy. We don't really have any strong evidence for that. Also, pig, goat, sheep, all the domestic animals you kind of would associate with like early medieval Britain. But in terms of the plants, it's really hard. There's really a lot of archaeological evidence because of the preservation issues. There's so much rainfall in Scotland that the soils are highly acidic, and this burns away a lot of the potential for archaeobotanical or seeds to be preserved. So really, we can only get at it through this starch or phytolith residues. At least this is the robust kind of approach that I've observed, luckily. So yeah, I guess in terms of early medieval diets are starting to be examined quite a lot by the kind of the burgeoning researchers. There's a really great study out focused on Anglo-Saxon and where they were using isotopes to examine these dietary strategies and comparing them to historical accounts. And what they found was that the historical accounts were not matching up to the isotopes. And so really, you'd find these like big lists from the Anglo-Saxon period and later medieval period. And what happens is this trend from the later medieval period kind of gets projected in time. There's like ostentatious feast, lots of meat, encouraging meat, discouraging vegetables. Vegetables don't make you healthy in the later medieval period, apparently. But their isotope finds suggested that was not the case. There's not any signature there in the bones that they've studied. So really, people were probably eating a good degree of blood. C3, they explain it. Plant cereal grains fall under C3 for process. So lots of bread, probably supplemented with vegetables as well, and a little bit of meat. And yeah, I can give you the resource for those two articles. They're really interesting. There's also a great Sam Leggett, the God Medieval, which is really good at explaining it too. But yeah, so generally, I think probably they're eating more plants than we give them credit for, but it's really hard to trace archaeologically. Now we're doing these new kind of glimpses through innovative archaeology.
That's really interesting. It makes me think, like, I've had a lot of conversations on this show in recent seasons, in particular, about how when we think about like traditional diets for different regions of the world, they tended to be more plant-based, not because it was like a trendy component to the diet, but it was just the reality of, meat being harder to come by, or you'd have like less meat than you would plant-based materials. And so it ended up taking up that shape as well. So seeing it kind of get reassessed as the science gets more definitive in the archaeological record is also really interesting. Mm-hmm. So in terms of, and you kind of spoke to this a little bit, but you want to talk, don't you? Yeah. In terms of looking at what you're finding with the Pictish sites and the historical narratives that were available, is there a lot of consensus? Like, are you seeing the historical narratives lining up with what you were finding, or are you finding that there's like a bit of divergence with that?
Yeah, to a certain extent. So the closest historical narrative we're going to find is the medieval Irish law tract. And really, those are just discussing like parts of society. So they'll discuss rules for like grazing your cattle on marsh, or there'll be like a ranking system, which is really in a weird way of like, so bread wheat is associated with things, whereas barley would be lower. That's like a common type of grain, but they have this kind of ranking system with the cereal. But to that extent, that's pretty much it. There's not a lot of, there's some of these king lists where it's like what we would have interpret as like kind of shopping lists for a feast from Anglo-Saxon England, which Leggett and Lambert talk about, where it's just like, you need 300 pigs and you need bushels, all of these different things. And they actually, in a different study, broke it down by caloric intake and tried to match it with how much you could reasonably eat. And it was way, way over like the amount of people that were estimated to attend these feasts. It was something like a crazy amount, like 4,000 calories for one meal. So they were like, no, this is not me. So yeah, we're really challenging ideas of what these meals look like. So, but really the historical accounts are not that reflective. I guess we really can't get the perspective of why people were writing them really. And then there's just other things which happen in other contexts where historians just overlook a lot of things. Because if you think about the perspective of the person writing it, They might not care if you're in kind of a matriarchal society. Have access to talking to the women, or they might not see that as important. So you'd have these huge holes in our historical record on different plant consumption metrics. So I'm sticking with the archaeology for a lot of it, but it is cool. There's really unique little bits and pieces kind of weight certain foods consumption.
That's a really excellent point, and I think one that needs to be like really emphasized too, right? Is that idea, even who's doing the science historically as well, like who's doing the archaeology, what questions they ask. Like I know that's been a big thing on this show is kind of like looking at archaeological evidence with different lines of thinking in a way that, allows for those broader holistic perspectives because we've all been in those like intro to anthro classes where people are just talking about hunting and forgetting about the gathering pieces of it too, right?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of forager farmer kind of metrics with the Picts and early medieval Irish cuisine. So yeah, I think there does tend to be anyway a division between agriculture and erosion and nuance that you're probably doing everything you can to get as much food as you can. But yeah, it just doesn't get recorded, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I'm curious, so, looking at the archaeological records for the region through time, and this was something you spoke a bit to in the article as well, is, certain grains kind of falling in and out of not necessarily popularity, but like consumption. So you see barley a lot in what you're finding. And then, there's potentially these shifts that are happening through time. So is that something that you're able to see through the archaeological record of like an emphasis on a particular type of grain and then shifting away in favor of something else?
So that's not something I observed because I was just within the early medieval period, or the Pictish period more specifically, which is 300 to 900 AD, which is quite a long chunk of time. We only like years of AD. So you would think there would be a trend, but really the remarkable thing for me was continuity. And that it's just focused on cereal grains throughout that whole chunk of time to be their favorite or maybe just the most lucrative or the one that we could find. But yeah, cereals are really central to the British economy, and particularly barley.
Awesome. Well, that's one of those things where when you can see that consistency through time too, it really speaks to the strengths of the region as well. And I'm curious, like in your perspective, were there any environmental changes happening through that period? Did that have a toll on local economies? Was that something that was kind of coming into play at all?
Hmm. Uh, Not as much as I've observed. There is a medieval warming period, but that didn't really factor in too much to the period that I was studying. Certainly couldn't see it through any change in consumption. Even in regard to different details that are food related, like architecture seemed relatively consistent as well. So, I mean, really the case is that, yeah, the continuity rather than legal change. It would be interesting to look at that expanding, into the late Iron Age period and throughout the medieval period and a little later would be interesting to see. But I mean, based on what we were talking about earlier, oats and barley are pretty consistent in starch nutrients. Yeah. If it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing.
Yeah, it's lasted the test of time clearly. And I think it also, again, like it speaks to if an environment's well suited to grow a particular type of crop and the local agricultural practices are like based on that and rooted in that, then the economy also like, why, yeah, as you said, why would you shift it if things are stable and consistent in a time where food is not always in abundance in other regions?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and what I also found interesting was, there wasn't any evidence for importing. There is some
Uh,
indication that there were some friendly-ish, maybe more on the bribey side of imported with there's some like rolling vessels that were found at Pictish sites. And there's also an interesting narrative surrounding silver as a bribe for the pick, not being as aggressive potentially. But yeah, no indication of foreign food stuffs, which I was kind of keeping one eye out for as well. So whether didn't like it, or I just didn't know about those signatures is another interesting part of the narrative as well.
Yeah, that also to the, element of mystery around the Picts in terms of their relationships with other communities too.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of, thinking about this more broadly and what you're seeing in terms of plant-based relationships through the medieval period for the Picts, what sorts of lessons can be applied, if any, around like how we understand farming and land use today?
Yeah, well, so maybe not necessarily restricted to the Picts, but other work I'm working on with ancient foodways. Um, I did a small study with Six Nations of the Grand River, looking at ancestral Haudenosaunee foods from archive collections at the Sustainable Archaeology at McMaster University. We were looking there to see, what did those meals look like, and how can we kind of understand those pre-colonial economies. And I think there's a really interesting case to be made understanding pre-capitalized food systems, looking at, self-sustaining, in the case of, indigenous peoples of so-called Canada, there's tens of thousands of years where they're sustaining themselves off of these smaller scale agricultural practices, horticulture. Certain groups would call them permaculture, but it's what, Haudenosaunee have always known, and have been able to successfully provide for the community that way. So I take the side of the argument where, we can reevaluate. We don't need to be doing industrial agriculture for everyone. Certainly, if you're fortunate to have access to land, and it is a new thing people should reconsider, as well as accessing these more ancestral foodways for everyone. So, in the Pictish sense, maybe we should be looking at eating more barley and oats rather than triticum, which is red wheat. It doesn't, we're not kings. We don't necessarily need to be having this like king status cereal all the time. I think it could promote more diverse, not only foods, but also growing practices, looking at heritage varieties, understanding how diverse people's diets were before. I think that's also another thing that we like to forget is that, we go to the grocery store and do varieties of things. It seems like there's only, like the one species of fish, but if you look at these ancestral ways, they're eating like 6 different types of squash. And that's just for a small scale operation. So I think there's a lot of more come at it from like an anarchist archaeological perspective where it's like, how can we demonstrate that we don't have to do things the way we're doing them now? There's other evidence, lots of long-term evidence to support our food waste.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because that's something, I mean, I know that's something that we've talked about in the past too, but I think particularly having archaeologists speak to that and provide that kind of like that data for food sovereignty and kind of reclaiming those spaces, thinking about our relationship with industrial farming a little bit more critically as well. Using the knowledge of the past, and even I think the thing that I often come back to when I'm thinking around it too is like, oats and barley might not be like the sexiest foods that you could eat, but if they're the ones that are like able to grow well where you're living and they're providing a range of nutrients, and as you said, like the diversity of foods in those local economies, I think it's really having to reevaluate what's able to be consistent and affordable and, works within those regions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So before we wrap up, do you mind sharing where people can, I know you're going to share some resources as well, but where people can find you if they'd like to follow along and learn more about the really fascinating work that you're doing?
Yeah, so for the most part, I'm pretty light internet present, partly to chagrin, partly to just keep myself sane. But mostly you can find me on Instagram. Handle is Prado. I'm pretty active on there. I like to share lots of content about like what we've talked about today. I have a sort of a penchant right now for using ecological design in like buildings and architecture and landscape design. So if you're interested in that, checking about that part of life and also ancient histories, these things. If you want to get a look at what starches and phytoliths look like, probably just a visualization. I have that online. The database called the McMaster Microbotanical Research Database, and the link is MAC, MAC, Microbot. But yeah, I'm sure Sarah will the list. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the most part.
Awesome. Yeah, 100% we'll put that in. And I very much encourage people to check that out because it's just so beautiful to look at and not something that you get to see normally. Yeah, it's an awesome collection. Well, thank you so much for joining me, or us, Shalen. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
That was Dr. Shalen Prado. I've linked her resources and social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at my website at AnthroDish.com under episodes. Thank you for listening to AnthroDish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. It really helps get the word out. For more AnthroDish, sign up for my newsletter at sarahdugan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook at AnthroDish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're thinking about food. Sound editing and music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. AnthroDish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.